This is our chance to offer some summing up, some putting into perspective what we've been hearing and talking about these last few days. And it's been an incredibly stimulating conference, so many fresh ideas, so many people doing innovative work, and clearly there is an emerging international movement on the study of psychedelics and to try to figure out how to bring that into the culture. So the question is, where do we go from here? Is this mainly a conversation about using psychedelics for therapeutic uses, or is it much bigger? Is it raising fundamental questions about the nature of cultural transformation, perhaps jump-started by the use of psychedelics? So I'm going to sort of throw that out there to our distinguished panelists here. Henrik, you are one of the organizers of this conference. Let me start with you. What's your take? Is psychedelics mainly about therapy or about something much more?
So thank you for the question. So I think we should definitely start and concentrate on clinical applications. But as I made clear from my point of view in my opening talk, we also need a space for self-exploration that is newly defined, that is not working on the symbolism of traditional uses, while acknowledging, while valuing these traditions. And I don't know exactly when this is supposed or going to happen, because there are also major legal issues to overcome in working with healthy people. But also from a harm reduction perspective, I think we should create spaces in which self-exploration could happen. Now, the other question is, in how far should these self-exploration spaces be guided, or how should discussions about the background be in these spaces? But we may talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah? Does anyone want to make the case that we should jump straight into talking about the possible implications and applications for the larger cultural transformation?
All right. So I'll make a comment on that. So I agree that currently the clinical focus is appropriate because there's a need to gain acceptance in our current cultural context. But if we take a look at what that context looks like, there are massive imbalances in different world systems. There's massive income inequality. There is ecological crisis. And all of these imbalances, if you trace them down to their root, I would argue, trace down to a belief that someone has to, in order to win, someone else has to lose. This kind of distorted notion of survival of the fittest. And I think that belief is taught to us by every institution in our society. And in fact, it's the greatest source of, it's the greatest source of support for the current paradigm. So I think psychedelics have the potential to help us question that belief.
Why would psychedelics help us question that belief?
Well, for one thing, one of the hallmarks of the psychedelic experience is connectedness. And so I think that goes directly against this kind of rigidly individualistic kind of belief system. And I also think that psychedelics allow us, in many cases, to step back and peer behind the curtain. The idea that we live in a world of scarcity is culturally constructed, but it's something that most of us accept as a fact. So I think psychedelics give us the ability in some cases to recognize, to question that fact and recognize that it's actually something that's been created. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thomas, let me turn to you. You are our resident philosopher here on the panel. Do you see psychedelics as a vehicle for cultural transformation?
Yes, obviously they are, and I don't want to repeat myself. I have made my positive proposals for that transition in the talk on the opening evening. I have offered 5 building blocks for discussion. I have my ideas, so what we need, I think, is a rational, evidence-based protocol for enculturation that doesn't stop only with clinical applications, because we risk that there are people who just pursue their academic career in a Darwinist fashion and don't care about the social context. So it has to be a little more holistic, but again, I've said what I think about how we should approach this. Just perhaps one practical proposal, this conference has created an enormous amount of connectivity and brought many, many different things together. And now we will all go home, and we should find some way of preserving that connectivity, some sort of a server or a newsletter or so. And I think the foundation should urgently think about how all these people in this room can keep in touch with each other.
Thomas likes to give us talks. Also with the Enculturation protocol, he gives us tasks all the time. Tasks.
Let's talk about the future of public health care. And if you look in your crystal ball, 10 years, 20 years down the road, and I'm going to sort of direct this to, I'll start with you, Matt. Do you think therapies using psychedelics will be a small part of mental health care in the future, or will it be a fundamental key component of mental health care?
I think in the long term, it's going to play a large role. I think it's critical that it be data-driven, but that's where I'm placing my bets. I think there is a very large role that could be played by psychedelic treatments. In fact, something I often find myself saying more often is, I really think there's a lot of potential as a first-line treatment, not after you've tried 5 or 6 other things, because in fact, with the risk mitigation strategies at play in the clinical research, which I would highly advise be at play in future potential clinical use, there is a very favorable risk-benefit profile when you compare it to a lot of what's done in medicine and in psychotherapy. And I will add a little briefly about the cultural transformation. One of the things I like about the work we've done at Johns Hopkins is that we've consistently from the beginning had that thread, including currently with healthy normals, people without nominal problems to fix, but also have explored a number of therapeutic indications and we'll be looking at a number of additional ones. I think we have to proceed cautiously in terms of how we speak to the public, and I personally I want to be clear that there are dangers and that wide dissemination in the public, it's going to lead to harms depending on the nature of the way people are using. And if it's widespread, there are going to be reckless individuals, so there will be harms. We know these are powerful tools. So, that said, I obviously think there is a lot to learn, and there is potential in the betterment of well people. And so I think we have a responsibility to pursue that track, but then also speak very cautiously about how that proceeds moving forward.
Franz, let me ask the same question to you. Do you see therapeutic use of psychedelics as a major part of future treatment of mental illness?
I see 2 things. So we have done so many studies the last 20 years, more than 1,500 subjects we have studied, and we went from healthy to group settings now and meditation settings in the Alps and using normal people, and this was a progress used 20 years. And now we do clinical studies in Switzerland and in Europe, multi-center studies, including Germany, France and Italy, and it is a slow thing. But we also go down to the molecular level and study what is going on with emotion regulation, which is important. You don't need visuals with SAR. And I have been contacted in the last maybe 12 months by 8 companies who have a bunch of psychedelics that are not visual. So there will be a tremendous new development of new drugs through psychedelics. And psychedelics will play a minor role in the future. That's my perspective.
Wait, psychedelics will play a minor role?
I think so. Yeah, the classic.
Ah, interesting. Well,
just yesterday came a paper out from Japan. Even the Japanese are running after all these kind of drugs.
You mentioned that a lot of companies have expressed interest in this. So
They do it.
Let's talk about big pharma. Here.
Yeah, they're big farmers.
Are we, in the future, will the development and the production of psychedelics be dominated by 2 or 3 major multinational corporations?
In 10 years, yes.
In 10 years?
I'm convinced.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I can think about the US market, for example, with USONA and MAPS. We have nonprofits on the scene that I think actually change the entire landscape for traditional corporations precisely because they're not profit-driven. They undermine traditional corporate pricing strategies. So I think if there's any industry where we should start to see a new paradigm emerge, I can't imagine a better one, and I'm very hopeful about it.
I say a word about that. And I completely agree. That was, this whole idea that entities like USONA and MAPS going the nonprofit route actually changes the entire game for those other entities that will inevitably jump into this field. And if we're onto something, and the data suggests we are, those characters will be in the field. So I think it's inevitable if we are into successful outcomes, and that those are essentially problems we want. That's going to happen. And, and I also think we really have to look for, really look at individual entities for what they're doing, not necessarily just whether they're making a profit or not, but how they're behaving in this space.
But if it's true that psychedelics will be used more and more in future therapies, I mean, there will need to be a massive production of these substances, right? Can that be done in the nonprofit sector? I mean, or is this what big pharmaceutical companies do?
The question is a little bit different also. If you look what's really going on in depression, we do depression, major depression, how many additional hours we put into that treatment. It's not the one day of experience. It's the preparation, it's the training of patients, it's the aftercare. So you need a medical model, and it's not so cheap. So the question is, how can you optimize that? We try to optimize that insofar that, for instance, they have mindfulness training, they have neurofeedback, we think about VR combination with psychedelics, we have all kinds of gadgets. Patients are very interested playing games, and you can optimize that, but it's a matter of cost. It's quite expensive.
Do you want to throw out a number there? What do you think it would cost to bring a product on the market?
We did a calculation that the psychedelic day, at least in Switzerland, is about 500 or 1,500 francs per day. If you need more therapists, at least 20 hours. Our experience shows in the mean 22 hours additional therapeutic support. And then you have a lot of other things, pharmacy, and it's not cheap. And we compared that to citalopram. We could treat with the same cost a normal patient 1,500 days. So that's the key to things.
Henrik?
So it's obviously expensive, but maybe
in our hands it's not cheap because people have the little bit a nice view, which I also had to take it once or twice, but depression is so different to existential anxiety. So we are very interested in the combination of psychotherapy and pharmacy. That's a new paradigm, but it will not be cheap. It has to become cheaper. And certainly that USONA, which I'm quite familiar with because I'm also in there, that's a good hope, but still it's not enough. Even in Switzerland, we were quite open. We got only attacked by politicians, never by the medical society. We have to change the politicians.
So that's interesting. Certainly, there's a lot of money that needs to be raised to get it out in the market, but maybe the simple opposition between non-profit and profit is really not mirroring the complexity. So we need regulations, we need standards that people need to agree on, no matter if they're profit or non-profit. maybe there will be new forms of working together between non-profits and for-profits. But I think that creating the standard and not getting a system that is currently developing in the cannabis field in some states, a Wild West of just making a good dollar, that seems to be important. And I also see a role for Europe here. I mean, in Europe we usually have the habit of talking about it and creating collaborations. And I hope that this will be the role also of European organizations working together with global organizations.
I would just add two things. Well, first, I agree that there's definitely an opportunity for new organizational models. But in response to the point about cost, yes, it's expensive. But if you look at the lifetime care costs, not just for mental illness, but for physiological illnesses of somebody with major depressive disorder, they're many times that of somebody who is not depressed. So part of it is actually is working with those who have to pay and putting pressure on corporations, if that's the case. But the point is that when you look at the cost-benefit analysis, I think it's actually much more favorable than that.
But look at the ketamine clinics in the US, which I know a little bit. They had the big hope, you give ketamine 1 hour, $1,500, by the way, and no aftercare. It's a mess. The things I've seen and the patients I've talked to, it's incredibly what's going on, just for money. And I also agree, you shouldn't do that for money. But it costs something. And the problem in the US is also you need an anesthesiologist in the background in certain areas. You need a special drug accounting. It becomes very expensive. When I saw the numbers they calculate for the treatment, that's who pays that? In Switzerland, at least, we would have at least a big fight with the insurance companies until they accept that. We have to show it's effective, it's faster, it's better than what is. When you go into the market, then you have to show it's better than SSRIs or it has some benefits towards something else. It's not just the psychedelic, it's the community, the medical community, and the authorities, what they want from you. And it's tremendous. We do phase 3 studies. We know what that means. It's not so simple.
I have a question from the audience that was given to me. Are there studies from the Netherlands or certain American states where some psychoactive substances, psilocybin or marijuana, where they've been legalized or decriminalized in some way? Is there any evidence from the use of these substances that it does or does not increase the number of drug addicts and abuse?
Just say our numbers, which we really have, there were 8 subjects in 1,000 who used a little bit more psychedelics. It's not much.
And one thing, when we start talking about cannabis, it's so different in so many ways. Different drug, different patterns of use, different patterns of harms. What we're doing with medical development has nothing to do with how cannabis, the pathway, its change in legal status in the U.S. over the last couple of decades. But there are data on both in terms of its effects in positive and in negative ways for other forms of substance use problems, such as opioids. I still think we have to wait. There are some encouraging signs that might be helping reduce other problems, and this kind of comes down to whether it's serving as a complement or a substitute. It's incredibly complex. I think inevitably you're going to be increasing some harms in some ways, but
more
decreasing other harms, and so it's a net.
Right? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So to be clear, psilocybin, the 2 cities that have decriminalized it and have not legalized it, the framework does not allow for shops to be set up. At least in Denver, it just literally states it's the lowest law enforcement priority. So it's nowhere near where cannabis has gone in many of the states.
We've been talking more about the therapeutic uses and the challenges of application. Let me sort of step back for a moment and ask, I don't know if it's more of a science question or more of a philosophical question. Do you think there are any major insights that will emerge about the brain or the nature of consciousness because of your work on psychedelics? Thomas, let me turn to you here.
Well, yeah, this research is highly relevant from a philosophical perspective, not only for ethical reasons, but for instance, in isolating the minimally sufficient neurocorrelate of consciousness, in understanding our sense of realness, in understanding what goes wrong in depersonalization disorder, and so on and so on. I don't want to give a long talk here, but one thing I can really say that this research is highly relevant from a meta-theoretical perspective, from a philosophical perspective. That's very obvious. You can tell by the excellent young philosophers that are appearing on these conferences.
Yeah, that's true. That's impressive how many new theories come on the market, but they have to be tested. And we work on a program with Giulio Tononi and Marcella Massimi in Milano and Stephen Laurie in Belgium, where they measure the content of consciousness through EEG, and then you use TMS to stimulate the cord. We do that at the moment, and this gives you insight. What's the basis of consciousness? There are certain states where you have no content, but you are aware that you are. And this is the most interesting question. Why are you have a sense that you exist, but there's nothing going on, no emotions, no thoughts? And we can induce that with different technologies, and particularly with certain psychedelics. And that's a deep question for Thomas to answer. The no self. I like his book.
But this is interesting. You're talking about both psychedelics and new technology, like virtual reality technology.
I just have to reply to this. You seem to be unaware that I've just set up the MPE project, the Minimal Phenomenal Experience project, that researches exactly pure awareness experiences with Giulio Tononi as one of my colleagues, with Massimini contributing. So the question is, we are in the process of developing a psychometric instrument for the experience of bare awareness without content in advanced meditators. If we have this, we will of course immediately come to this community and see where the experience of pure awareness can be shown under psychedelics. What I want to know from Franz is actually, you introduced this idea of new non-classical psychedelics. If you think it's urgent that those more ethically grounded non-profits get into non-classical psychedelics as well and into the development of new substances.
They should. For instance, we have looked very detailed in the long-term effects. What's going to change in behavior? For instance, we saw in normal subjects, self-acceptance is increased, less materialistic thinking, more concern for others, highly significant. But the visual effects were not driving the change. It was the emotional alterations during the trip that were important predictors, and the loss of self-referential processing, the feeling of oneness. We could really tease that out statistically. And from molecular biology, there's a lot of going on deep down in certain pathways, which you can really tune psychedelics to push that, to have long-term effects. That would be nice psychedelics. You have better than MDMA.
Better than MDMA. Have you heard that?
Yeah, but that's also why we shouldn't concentrate on neurobiology and consciousness in a smaller understanding. We need to develop the normative context. We need to develop places where things can happen for longer lasting effects. That's a cultural question. I mean, otherwise we would just be doping people with psychedelics. What's that? So where are the normative contexts? A story I always like to tell people when they come to me with a love and light philosophy is in some sheep Hebrew tribes, people would be going for taking the heads of their enemies, killing them from the back. It's nothing. Like psychedelics don't make you go the Californian love and light way. So how does a normative context how is it attached, associated to psychedelics? I think a lot needs to be developed, and how do we secure that, or which groups are we going to see? Which kind of facilities, architectures? There is an open space for development beyond the neurobiological, and that's interesting.
There seems to be a tension. It's a little bit below the surface at this conference on sort of the medicalized model of psychedelics as opposed to, I guess, what I might call the more spiritual model. And I mean, it's striking that at this conference, we are heavily leaning towards scientists, academics, clinicians, and for very legitimate reasons, of course. I mean, in the effort to gain credibility and to move these substances to more widespread use. There is, of course, another approach.
But also because the makers of the conference believe in that.
But there is another approach. I mean, in terms of psychoactive use, indigenous people, shamanic healers, people who lead ceremonial practices. So my question is this sort of two sides of the same thing that we're talking about, or is there a more fundamental conflict here?
There's just so much going on in this area. I mean, one, it's not necessarily true that indigenous societies are having so-called spiritual or mystical type experiences on psychedelics. There's an argument to be made that that's a Western construct or meme that folks in Western society may be more likely to have, and it's a lot of times the issues in use by indigenous societies are more self-described as being pragmatic, curing this illness, this gut problem, who stole this from the neighbor, this type of thing. Also there's a lot of variability in what folks mean as spiritual. I'll ask one participant, was it a spiritual experience? And they just described feeling connected profoundly to everyone in their life, their loved ones, and a deep meaning in their life, and feeling part of a whole. And they say, well, no, not spiritual. I didn't see any angels or crystals. And then you ask another participant that said nearly the same thing, and they're like, didn't you hear what I just said? Duh. That's the definition of spirituality. So I think, it might be more helpful to talk about, whether it's, we're talking about supernatural or not. I mean, to me, I think it's kind of more useful to kind of dump the spirituality as a descriptor and really talk in more psychological language. None of those, there's religious and then there's spiritual but not religious, but then there's none of the above. And most of the none of the above people, if you ask them, do you love your family? Do you have a purpose in your life? Do you feel connected? Is there meaning in life? They'll say, yeah, that's the stuff I think is at the core of the experiences that are helpful for people.
I'll add something to that. I do think the word spiritual is a little tricky. But to go kind of to what I think you were trying to get at with your question, I think one way in which the medical model and even the scientific model, if you will, I think one of its kind of more subtle influences, it's very focused on the individual. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this kind of excessive form of individualism is the core issue in our society. So the way I like to think about it is focusing on individual healing, but also thinking about how psychedelics can be used to help repair community systems. And that, I think, gets us away from having to use words like spirituality, which are very loaded, and gives us a very direct and what I would argue is a legitimate focus for some of the healing work that psychedelics can do.
I want to throw it to the audience in just a minute, but one question before I do that. I'm curious about what you would see as we move forward and there are more conferences about psychedelics. What do we need in the next conference? What would be the ideal conference about psychedelics? Now, Thomas, you said, I mean, the most important thing coming out of this is connectivity, that people talk to each other, but there will be more gatherings like this in the future. What do we need to see in those future gatherings? What's your ideal psychedelic conference? More women. Good point.
Yesterday I got an email by the Green Party from Germany to support them, to speak to politicians in Germany, that they open up, that you could invite more politicians.
That's good. I also like, actually we should fight a little bit more. In general also about the epistemologies, because just having all kinds of social groups sit each next to each other with the idea of they all need to be in, that doesn't make a conference. I mean, the concept of fairness and equality, that's good, and we need to have it, but I learned something from the audience just an hour ago. So epistemological responsibility, the concept of epistemological responsibility seems to be important. So we can, if we develop a culture where psychedelics play a larger role, just letting it go and just getting them esoteric and new age market, their concepts out, and having people repeat it just as a model, and us as academics, but every citizen just sitting there and watching it, maybe making people unaware of their other duties in being a participant in civilian process, in voting, in getting the power issues, getting involved in the power issues. That's something we need to talk about. And that's a big thing. I think we should talk about that.
In terms of psychedelic conferences, I'll be limited and brief, but meetings for the public interested in the science of psychedelics and other aspects of psychedelics are really great. But something we have lacked is a forum for scientists to truly connect amongst themselves, more along the lines of a traditional scientific society.
And I guess I would add, as commercialization draws likely closer, more attention to delivery of care models and to public health. And I think that if there's more of an effort made to find people who want to talk about those subjects and research those subjects, then you'll see a response in the social sciences, and more academics will actually start to look at things from that angle. So.
What comes to my mind when I started, we had these ECBS in Germany, this Collegium for the Study of Consciousness, with Albert Hoffmann and Dietrich and Leo Hermle and all these guys, and I was also there. But in the end, we were 400 members, chemists, biologists, philosophers. You have been in Zürich, 94, the first time. But nothing happened. They always wanted to do a study. I remembered, we're going to do a study. We did a lot of studies in Switzerland. Germany never did a study. Because there was not a task force. There was not people standing together thinking about protocols, how you approach the ethics, how you approach the government. There should be really organized, concerted actions of the best people who know how it goes. It's nice to talk about it, but something should go out.
Okay, let's go to the audience here. Let's go right there.
So, I thank you so much for this conference and for your work. I think it's really admirable. I have a question because we've been talking a lot about context, but context has been also kind of ignored at the same time. And for example, from my perspective, I think it's very important to scientifically study certain things about context that include diversity, different practices. So for example, I think it's very important to start talking about how certain things influentiate psychedelic experience. I think, for example, we need to start measuring, I was remembering the conference of Ibogaine, where Alexander Tanus talked about how music influentiates psychedelic state and specific vibrations, or certain areas of the ceremonial aspects. So I think, can these elements be involved into serious scientific studies? And if yes, why hasn't it been done more? And how could these elements could be more part of scientific studies in the future? I think that's my question.
We have studied on the influence of music on psychedelics and how they interact, but it's a question of the regulatory system. When you want to bring the drug through, that it can be used in a medical context, then you would have to go for that combination, and you have to register that combination. You have to say this drug has to be used in that model, and that's a whole phase 3 study to do. That's the current situation. We have a lot of ideas how you could combine things, but on a phase 2 level, that means in the first 50 subjects you can do that and play around, but in the end you go with one model. It takes 10 years. That's reality.
And it sort of depends on, you know, what type of context we're talking about, but certainly, you know, in our studies, you know, the FDA in the United States has never reviewed our musical playlist, so we are free to. And so just thinking about that in terms of, you know, your point about Alexandre's, you know, concern about, how different musical vibrations affect psychedelic states. I think those are wonderful questions, and I see it as a limitation of opportunity. I mean, we need, you know, 100 times more psychedelic researchers. We need more people to get in the field. And there are a lot of questions. As I said on a panel earlier, the whole method of psychedelic therapy, wearing eye shades, high dose, laying down, introspection, there's not a lick of empirical evidence, a comparative study. Okay, what is that like without the eye shades? What is that like without the music? So we're going with the clinical model that seems to work pretty darn good, but that's all clinical observation and wisdom. I think we need to bring to bear empirical investigation to all of these factors, including, okay, what type of music works best, using music versus not, all of these factors. So we just need more people to get in the field and more funding. And, you know, so we haven't looked at variations in music, obviously, because it's like, hey, can we help cancer patients who are dying? Like, that's, you know, just a bigger question, and you can't examine but so many variables in one study.
It's nice what you say. But this guy thought about something different, that the music therapist works with the patient, and I had that experience. It's quite different than listening to music. Okay, it's nice, but it's not what works really. The interaction between two persons is incredible, powerful, and you can take music, you can dance, you can I paint a lot.
I want to. We're running very short of time.
And you can test that too.
I want to
Yeah,
squeeze in one more question here. Let's go to the woman in the middle there.
Hello. Oh, thank you. And thank you for the conference. So it's been a very Western focus on this conference. It's very much about the Western mythologies, the Western way of quantifying things, and what role does other traditions get in this? There's the Buddhist, the yogic traditions, there are the Shamanic traditions, which I have found great inspiration with personally. Are we sucking all the spirit and the mystical, the heart and the soul out of psychedelics sometimes by quantifying all of this, quantifying love, quantifying happiness, and quantifying so many things with this dominant Western way? What is there room for the other things?
Well, in a way, you were interested in coming to a conference that was marketing itself as scientific. It was designed as a scientific conference. So there are a lot of conferences out there that integrate more lifestyle-oriented matters, also traditional healing styles. What we wanted to do, and what we will do in the future even more, is to get a scientific view on these matters. If somebody does scientific work about yoga, and this is in combination with the psychedelic state, get them in here. So it's more about methodologies, it's more about systematic thinking. It could involve different methodologies. We have intentionally not invited a lot, maybe even no cultural anthropologists here. That doesn't mean that in future conferences this could not happen, but the quality of this must be high, I think. I have worked together with cultural anthropologists for 12 years, and in many psychedelic conferences, I find the quality of argumentation very low. So it's more advertising your own lifestyle. It's a lot about your own experience. When we have a psychedelic conference, I actually want to gather knowledge. I want to have new ideas. I want to fight with you. So, and about better knowledge, because I can have a psychedelic experience anytime if I want to. And that's not what I'm hitting at when I have when I'm organizing a platform for people to debate on knowledge, on norms, and where we want to go.
Do you want to follow up?
Can I just, so there's different way of viewing knowledge, that's my point. So you say that knowledge is about collecting data and being, coming with this Western model of science. In the yogic philosophy, it's about exploring yourself, about getting to know yourself, and about making change from within. So if you're a better person, that will mirror out on other people. So it's an experiential knowledge, which I think is, psychedelics is actually experiential knowledge. Music is, dance is, etc.
Just one sentence. I'm afraid we will be extinct if we wait for everybody to change their selves. So I think taking that model to a scientific exploration would be interesting. How long does it take for people to change in order to change their behaviors? For example, I was invited to just a brief example, to a psychedelic festival in Middle America and Panama. And then I looked at what was happening there. 1,000 hippies are using airplanes. The CO2 balance of that is terrible. They were inviting people from South America to give shamanic workshops. They treated these people like shit. Their women needed to clean the toilets of the, let's call the Westerners, the hippies who were attending the conference. So, although this was about self-exploration, or it was marketed like that. The real consequence, the behavioral consequences of that inner work were really, well, I couldn't take it serious.
I'm gonna jump in here because we could keep going. I can tell we could go for another hour here, but we are out of time. Thank you, all of you who came. Thanks to our wonderful panel.